The number of athletes who come from the lower socioeconomic status backgrounds have far less likelihood of being seen, of being recruited, because of how the system now works, where the players are supposed to travel around the country to go to those college coaches.
Welcome to Sports Mom Rapport, where we support and connect with moms of athletes while sharing helpful advice from each other and some guest experts along the way. This is Tara.
And I'm Destiny. Thank you for joining us as we highlight you incredible moms. Welcome to Sports Mom Rapport. In today's episode, we're thrilled to have two remarkable guests with us. Jean Linscott, a clinical psychologist specializing in child, adolescent, and family therapy, and Kenneth Ruoff, a historian and college professor. Not only are they both former athletes, but they're also parents of three grown children who experience the highs and lows of youth in college sports.
Jean and Ken have just released a powerful new book titled What is the Goal? The Truth About the Youth Sports Industry. This book dives deep into the youth sports industry, highlighting the rise of pay-to-play dynamics, financial pressures, and the overwhelming chase for prestige in college admissions. But at what cost? Today, they'll be sharing their insights on how these shifts may impact our children's well-being and why it's crucial to keep their health and happiness at the forefront.
We'll explore the importance of letting kids lead their own sports journeys, the value of regular check-ins, and how to navigate this complex landscape as parents. This is definitely a conversation you won't want to miss. So let's get started.
Welcome, Jean and Ken. To start off, will you both introduce yourselves and share a bit about your backgrounds, both professionally and as parents of athletes? We'd love to hear about your journey that led you to write What is the Goal? The Truth About the Youth Sports Industry.
Professionally, I am a clinical psychologist and trained with a specialty in child and adolescent and family. Been practicing in the field since 1993. Various settings, hospitals, clinics, private practice. Children, in many ways, are my passion. Personally, I was a youth and high school athlete, but always a big sports fan. Come from a big sports loving family of many children who played various different sports. Ken and I met each other when we were both playing high school sports, and I was his biggest fan watching him play college sports. So that was the beginning of our sports enjoyment together. And then eventually we had three children, all of whom loved every sport they ever played, got connected to their recreational sports worlds. Ken as their coach and me as their supporter, driver, and the support background for the coach when he would want to talk about the different kids on the field. That was our early journey. As our kids got older, we began to ask ourselves many questions about an industry that looked very alien from what we were used to, and began to try to seek some answers to some very complicated questions about what was going on for our children and the rest of the youth in this country in the youth sports industry. So that's where I'll pause and let Ken introduce his background.
Yeah, I'll start with professional as well. I'm actually a historian of Japan, which of course is distant from this book in some ways, but in other ways, historians are trained to recognize change. And I could hardly believe the extent of the change in youth sports in one generation, because I had strong memories of what youth sports were like when Jean and I were kids. And then when our kids were experiencing it, it was like, whoa, what's happened? It costs a lot of money. The kids fly around the country, et cetera, and they are expected to play so many practices and games, it starts to feel like a job. And so it was quite different from before. And then, you're very busy raising kids. That's no secret to anybody with kids. But as our last one was wrapping up high school, basically we sort of looked at each other and we were like, what have we just been through with pay-to-pay club sports? It was like, wow, we've been through like some real insanity. And we might have even started writing for therapeutic purposes just to try to get our heads around what we'd been through. But it didn't take long before we realized that we had a book.
Very interesting. Thank you for the introductions, for giving us a little background on why you wrote this book. It's out on Amazon now, probably at the time that we are releasing this podcast.
And you can find it on many other online booksellers, and you could go to your bookstore or your library and ask them to order it.
Perfect. Thank you for sharing. The two of you mentioned that you obviously grew up doing athletics and sports yourselves. Ken being a college athlete, you had children who participated in sports. Will you share with us what some of the most rewarding aspects of your children's involvement in youth sports were?
So many aspects. It's wonderful when you see your kids out there on the field, on the court, pouring their passion into the game, giving it their all, trying against all odds to see if they can help the team move forward to a win when they're coming from behind. And just the pure joy of playing. You can see it on their faces when the conditions are right. That's one of the best benefits for me as a parent, is to have them involved in something that's good for their bodies, it's good for their minds, can be done right, good for bodies and minds. And they learn to be part of something bigger than themselves, which is the team, and to make sacrifices for the team.
I agree with everything Jean said. I would just stress that we're very pro youth sports. The book is not intended to be critical of youth sports. It's intended to be critical of the fact that it has become an industry, and it's very market-based. And when you introduce profit into the equation, often the people involved are no longer thinking about what's best for the kids. But we're very, very pro youth sports.
Yes.
So I appreciate you clarifying that the purpose of the book isn't to say that youth sports as an industry is bad, but more so maybe the way that it's rolled out in different areas and different markets is definitely something that is very different than what you experienced growing up. Thank you for sharing that.
Yes, thank you. Along those lines, what do you think are some of the most common traps that parents fall into when they're trying to support their children's athletic dreams, and how can they avoid them?
Well, one is thinking that this is about them, not the child, and playing too much off of the prestige. And a lot of parents get caught up in this, particularly with the pay-to-play system, because there's something tempting about telling the neighbor that your kid was at a tournament in San Diego this past weekend playing such and such sport, and it sounds impressive when in fact there probably are 30 tournaments going on across the country. So for the initiated, it's not as impressive as it sounds. But what is it really about? Bragging rights for the parent, or is it because it's a meaningful experience for the child? So hopefully parents try to avoid it being about themselves instead of the child.
I guess I would add to that, we strongly encourage parents to think about whether or not they have a script in mind of how this is all supposed to turn out for their child, this sports journey, and to be careful about having that script written ahead of time in your own mind about what the outcome needs to be. Because your child is a developing person with their own separate identity from you. And it may be that how they feel about this game at age 7 is very different than how they feel about this game at age 13 and 18, etc. And you need to be prepared to help the child figure out for how long participating in this game or others is right for them, versus the enormous appeal or pull that comes for parents when preferential admission to college and scholarships. They hear about this when their kids are 2 and start thinking, I better get ready. But what you want for your kid may be very different than what your kid wants for themselves. And you are not playing. They are. And there are so many different paths to success and physical fitness and enjoyment of peers and a successful college experience. So think very carefully about, if you have a script ahead of time, you need to be willing to rethink and flex and potentially rewrite that along the way, no matter how talented an athlete you have.
Those are both excellent points. You think about the prestige and the parents. Yes, they're very proud of their kids. We are all proud of our kids, no matter what level they're at. But it's not about them. It's about our children and making sure that they're happy. So I love how you're reinforcing to make sure that you're looking at from your child's viewpoint and making sure that you include them in the conversation, that they need to be 100% in. And this is about them and what they want to do. So thank you for that.
It actually makes me think too about within one family, you could have one child that's incredibly driven and set very strong, ambitious goals. And then you could have another one that's enjoying the sport for the sport. And it could probably be pretty confusing for parents in that regard too, because your sister did this or your brother did this. And then the other sibling may feel some pressure within the family to excel or achieve at a certain level. So I can imagine the fortitude that it takes for parents to pause, take a look in the mirror and say, what is this all about? This is my child's future, and I need to listen to him or her and really hone in on what it is that my child needs and wants. That was very helpful. Thank you for that. According to your research and personal experience as well, what practical advice can you give to parents to ensure their sports experiences are positive and healthy? For example, what questions should they be asking their children? What are ways that they can check in to ensure that the child is still having fun, besides just saying, are you having fun? Do you still love it?
Well, I'll start this and then turn it over to Jean because it's mostly Jean's area. But let me just say this. Parents, before they enter into the pay-to-play travel club system, should firmly get their heads around the notion that they're making a lifestyle choice, that they should set aside 40 weekends for the next 9 years, because those 40 weekends are going to be devoted to the sport. There's going to be travel for tournaments. There's going to be tournaments in town. There's going to be endless games and practices. So it is a lifestyle choice, and the parents need to decide whether this lifestyle is appropriate for the family. So that's one important thing.
For the children, often that lifestyle that involves all sorts of games on all sorts of weekends and often travel in the beginning is really fun and really excited. They're going to new places. They're flying on an airplane. They're with their friends. They get to stay in a hotel. And often that starts out as very exciting and fun. But their experiences, as positive as they may start as youngsters, can change as the journey goes along. They have different interests that can develop. They may have a peer group that becomes more important to them at their school, and maybe they want to play a school sport. They can start to experience the pressures at the older ages of coaches who are wanting to see if they can develop these players to go on and play at higher levels, and the pressures of coaches competing for the talented athletes to play on their team and in their club. They can start to feel like they're not appreciated for what they can give, more so than what they need to be for their parents and their coaches. And so one of the questions that we write about in the book is as simple but as complicated as at the beginning of each season, long before you're writing that check, that you really sit down and have an honest conversation and be willing to take no for an answer when you ask the child, do you want to play again this year? You have to be willing to entertain in your own mind, no matter how talented they are, no matter how much money you have paid, no matter what promise the coaches say they have. You have to be willing to find reasons in your own mind where it will be okay to allow your child to say, no, you don't have to continue. There's always competing parenting truths. Encourage them to see it to the end, give it their all, develop to their highest potential, versus the other competing parenting truth, which is find what you love, find who you want to spend your time with, find what matters more to you than what may matter more to your parent in their dream of what they see you doing. And so we encourage parents to ask questions of the children. If they say, I don't like it anymore, instead of like, oh, but it's so fun, and encouraging them, of course you like it, you're just tired or discouraged. You need to understand what about this they don't like anymore. And you would be surprised if you ask those questions. They have a lot of good reasons for not liking this game. As young as age 13, the research tells us that 70% of youth athletes are quitting organized sports, some of them as they're just barely getting started. There's a lot going on for these kids in youth sports that didn't occur for us. A lot of it has to do with the pull of college admissions.
What I'm hearing through all of this is really emphasizing the fact that it's not about the parent and emphasizing the child. And so making sure that as a parent, we're having continual check-ins with our child and not making it about our own agenda, but what makes the child happy and where they're thriving. But I did have a secondary question to that, more so regarding specializing and multi-sport. In order to avoid the pitfall of potentially not enjoying a set sport again, would it be your advice to encourage our children as long as they can to not specialize and to continue in the multi-sport so that they don't get burned out?
Yes, definitely. And this is actually an area where, according to the new conditions, the parents may have no choice but to intervene for the following simple reason is that there'll be coaches that are going to try to get them to specialize in one sport. And they can be rather unpleasant about it, threatening playing time. And so sometimes the parent has to step in and take part in meetings with coaches where it's explained that the kid is going to play multiple sports and we're asking for cooperation. And if there's not going to be cooperation forthcoming, then perhaps it's time to find a different coach or club for one of the sports. But large numbers of great athletes credit not having specialized early on with their success eventually in one sport.
And when you start to take a look at the research behind overuse injuries, there's all kinds of agreement out there in the medical organizations who are advocating for preventing overuse injuries that says single sport specialization at a young age is a very bad idea. But for the clubs, it's a very good idea for their business model. And there lies one of the major conflicts.
I love how you talked about the check-ins and being willing to take no for an answer. That's a beautiful point that you made. And I want to go ahead and ask you, you mentioned the prestige of the parents and all. How does the history of youth sports reflect the current emphasis on prestige and college admissions?
If I could talk about one big change, there's no question that probably from the beginning of human civilization that humans have been trying to assert status and claim prestige. So there's nothing new, but I would venture to say that it's only in the last generation that now youth sports looms large in the sort of projection of prestige. We have a child on such and such club team who's off to San Diego this weekend for a tournament. And actually next weekend, they're off to Chicago. And the weekend after, they're off to Orlando.
And they're playing up 2 years and they're 8 years old.
Sports have always been an area where parents took pride, and frankly, parental bad behavior in sports is also not new, but it's become monetized. It very much speaks to socioeconomic class because only about 15% of Americans can take part in it. When you see 8 and 9-year-olds wearing expensive uniforms that don't make them better players, that's a social status message. It has nothing to do with developing athletes. It's that we can afford these expensive uniforms from Nike or Adidas. And that part of it is new. I mean, it is like a status symbol in the US to have kids involved in pay-to-play travel sports. The historian in me tells me that is new to this generation.
And the pipeline to the elite universities and the status that's involved with those types of admissions, that is a relatively new pipeline too, with preferential admissions for athletes.
Okay, so you mentioned that in the United States that you're noticing this status change. Can you compare the United States to some of the other countries and perhaps what they may do to prevent that?
Well, the biggest difference, I mean, being a professional athlete is something that is sought after worldwide. And of course, only a tiny percentage of people make it. The biggest difference in the US is actually quite simple. We have this thing called college athletics, and it's a big deal. And we have preferential admission. Nobody else does that. In the rest of the world, it's either you eventually make it as a professional and everybody else is rec. And they don't do these organized sports in college with professional coaches and all. And so that adds a layer of prestige to say, oh, my kid is playing soccer at Williams College. You've got double prestige. You've got the fact that Williams is one of the elite colleges, and you've got the fact that the kid is playing a sport. And by the way, almost 40% of the students at Williams are athletes who got preferential admission because of the fact that they're athletes. And so if you want to get into a place like Williams, under the present conditions, playing a sport is one interesting way to go about it.
And very few families can afford to pay to play.
Yeah. So who's getting preferential admission is very much of a interesting topic. It's the socioeconomic elite, because only the socioeconomic elite can apprentice their children for a decade to learn how to play water polo, squash, tennis, soccer, up to a level that these universities will then say, oh, we're just taking them because they're athletes, when they're probably taking them in no small part because they fit their business model, which is they're from the socioeconomic elite, they will pay full tuition, and they will likely donate on top of it, which is what the elite private schools in the US sort of depend on. That's their business model.
Interesting. So you're saying that in most all other countries, academics and sports are kept separate?
Almost entirely. Almost the entire rest of the world has entrance exams for colleges. Extracurriculars are of no significance whatsoever.
That's not something that really occurred to me. So I'm sure our listeners will be interested to hear that as well.
Other countries, their pro sports teams will recognize the youth and pull them into their system, and the youth are not paying to participate in that pro team's development system.
Yeah. And in other countries, it's about finding the incredibly small number of kids who might actually go on to play professionally. And then for everybody else, it's rec. I mean, if you try to explain to, for example, a French family, perhaps not a French family that has spent time in the US, you tell them, my kid plays on the soccer team at Swarthmore. And they're sort of like, is that like being on the hiking club at a university in France? Because we have clubs. What does it mean to be on the soccer team? Because nobody else has what we have here in the US. And so they'll be sort of puzzled. But I'm not saying it can't be a great experience. I played sports in college and had a wonderful experience, but it's just that we are really the only ones who do it this way and put such emphasis on college athletics and also give the kids who are athletes a leg up in admissions.
Interesting. Thank you for clarifying the difference in our culture versus the rest of the world.
It is interesting. I'm listening to all of this information, and it does give a perspective that I have not obviously done research like the two of you have. And I can only speak anecdotally. My husband is a college athletics coach, and they have had instances that athletes have not been accepted into programs despite being recruited. So I think I would like for you to maybe address that a little bit, because I don't want our listeners to get the wrong idea here. I just want it to be clear that that is obviously not all instances for all athletes that are performing in college in the United States.
No, you have to meet basic academic standards. But we should keep in mind that for every, I don't even know what it's down to for places like Harvard and Stanford, like 3% of applicants get admitted. Of the students who apply to Stanford and Harvard, probably 50-60% of them are academically qualified. So then you have to make difficult choices. And it's not just sports. It's when extracurriculars come into play. Someone could write a book about the youth music industry, which is actually similar to the youth sports industry in terms of the amount of money that's being spent and the intense competition. But the athletes do get preferential admission. And so it gives them an edge. This is not to say that they're not academically qualified, but there are lots of people who are academically qualified, and yet the athletes have this extra edge in actually getting admitted.
And very few of those athletes come from socioeconomically disadvantaged families anymore because of the cost of playing in the pay-to-play system.
And two of our kids deserved to get into where they were going, but maybe in one case, the soccer made a difference in terms of them definitely getting in. It wasn't like they weren't academically qualified, but there's only so many students who get admitted to the uber elite places.
The number of athletes who come from the lower socioeconomic status backgrounds have far less likelihood of being seen, of being recruited, because of how the system now works, where the players are supposed to travel around the country to go to those college coaches. The college coaches don't go find them in their home clubs, with maybe extremely rare exceptions of junior national team level athlete.
And please put aside football and basketball, because for those two big money sports, they will find the kids wherever. In fact, college football and college D1 basketball in the US actually resemble how professional clubs like FC Barcelona scour the world for talent. But if you look at who's getting admitted for almost all of the other sports, they tend to come from the socioeconomic elite. You could ask yourself, so what's the difference? The problem is that the colleges tend to portray themselves as engines of social mobility, in no small part to keep their tax-free status. We're a social good. We give kids opportunity, and obviously they do to a considerable extent. But why give athletes preferential admission? What's going on there? And part of it, we believe, is that it allows them an excuse to admit from the socioeconomic elite, which is useful to their business models, which rely on full tuition paying students and also families that will donate on top of the tuition and donate after graduation as well.
Yes, sports are a fun, gratifying experience for most college athletes and for many students who go and watch and cheer on the games. It's a lot of fun, sure. They're going to donate back to the colleges where they enjoyed that sports culture.
This is true. Listening to you both talking about the socioeconomic status, those that are in the pay-to-play sports have more visibility, have more opportunities to be recruited. And then once they're recruited, then they usually apply to the college. And I mean, I've seen it firsthand. You do get preferential treatment as long as your grades are up to status and up to par. You are going to be admitted into the university, and you do have a leg up and a bit of an advantage of getting into the university. So thank you for explaining that a little more.
Switching gears a little bit, Jean, from a psychological perspective, what impact do you see the financial strain of youth sports having on family dynamics and the children's well-being?
It's kind of a simple equation, although maybe it's counterintuitive or something that the parents don't spend a lot of time thinking about. But there is some good research to show that the more a parent invests financially in the child's youth sports participation, the more perceived pressure the child feels to stay and play. The more return on the parent's investment that they are hoping for, the parents hope for, we've spent all this money, it's going to get us something in terms of a good college experience, prestigious college, maybe a scholarship to help us cover the enormous costs, right? The more the parents are looking for that return on investment, the harder it is for the kids to find a way to step back. And the less the child feels that this is their decision, that they are the one driving the train, and that they have a lot of expectation to live up to. But what if they're some of the 80%, you can correct my numbers, that don't go on to play college sport.
98%
90%.
or something, 97.
What is that doing to the relationship between the parent and the child during those high school years when there's all of these expectations? And what if they can't deliver? What if the child sees an example from their parents that we'll ignore the doctor's order about concussions and we'll let you play a little bit longer because this is a really important showcase tournament that you have to be seen or you'll miss out. What is the message that's being given to these kids? What's more important? Themselves, their bodies, their autonomy, or money and prestige? And the only way to peel a potato is through a sports access to college versus many different routes to physical activity and a positive college experience.
Thank you for breaking that down.
Ken and Jean, what role do you believe that coaches and sports organizations should play in supporting the well-being of these young athletes?
Well, I would like to think, because we're talking about kids here, we're not talking about the NFL or the NBA. We're talking about kids, that they're actually thinking about what's best for the kids. But once, for example, money enters into the equation, it becomes more tricky to think about what's best for the kids. Is it really best for the kids to play year-round one sport? No. All of the experts who are not involved in making a living from the youth sports industry would argue that it's not good, but it's good for the clubs. I would like to commend all the coaches who try to make it fun for the kids, who try to make it meaningful, who try to teach life lessons. It's not just about winning, although the youth sports industry sort of requires winning because that's how you get more customers, in no small part by winning. And so hopefully they're steering kids in the right direction. But we're talking about a system at this point that even the best intentioned individuals are bumping up against some tough realities. I'm about developing young soccer players. They all tell you that. But at the same time, there's something called State Cup, a tournament at the end of the season. The club really badly wants to win as many State Cups as possible because you can put those photos of the trophies being hosted for the State Cup on the website, and new parents looking for the best club will hopefully come to your club because you won the most State Cups. But winning State Cups may have nothing to do with actually developing young athletes. So why should it matter at, say, U11 to try so hard to win the State Cup? So it's the system, an overall system that has emerged and is not at all regulated, that is the problem, even as we have encountered many wonderful people who are trying to do the right thing, all of the right things that you can imagine for kids in sports.
I might ask that coaches and clubs do their best to keep up with. There's a lot of research out there. There's a lot of good science, a lot of good data out there about how to keep athletes healthy and safe. And many clubs work really hard to follow the best practices in terms of rest time and injury prevention and things like that. But again, as Ken mentioned, there's no one regulating that. There's no one checking up on that we know of. And so a lot of times what can happen is that the parents are pushing so hard for there to be more, better. Maybe if my kid practices 5 days a week, they'll be ready for this coach or this tournament that's coming up next fall. And they will push the clubs to try to ignore best practices, whether it be pitch counts for baseball players or number of games per practice time in soccer. Parents are equally complicit in this very complicated system that chews up the minds and bodies of its youth athletes far more than it should.
Even though we'd been in this industry for 25 years with 3 kids, when we took a really careful look at the websites of the various pay-to-play clubs, we were amazed at the nomenclature that has developed, the marketing nomenclature. And one of the curious terms that you see over and over is a promise of return on investment. Well, it's perhaps understandable because, you can be shelling out as much as $30,000 by the time the kid is older and really traveling all around the country. So what does return on investment typically mean when the clubs are plugging it? It means a place on a college team. That's really what they're suggesting the return on investment is. And I'm pretty sure this is a big difference from when Jean and I were kids. My parents, I was the youngest of five, and unfortunately, they got too old for me to ask them, what was your return on investment from driving me to my little league games or picking me up from my high school practice before I could drive? But I would have to assume that it would have been, well, we wanted you to be happy. We wanted to socialize you and we wanted to keep you off drugs by keeping you busy and things like that. I don't think that they would have been like, well, by goodness, we were prepping you for preferential admission or something like that. Because this is the main thing that the clubs advertise at their websites. Our alumni went to these colleges. We got them spots. Never do they tell a story about, yeah, we had this wonderful kid who played with us through the high school years and now works helping addicts overcome their addiction and didn't play a single minute of college sports, or a kid who's now working for the United Nations or whatever. I mean, it's all about who went on to play college sports. So that is the return on investment that's promised. Although it's snake oil for most families, because most families never have that come true.
One last piece that I would add that I would ask of clubs is to keep track of injury data from the young ages. I know it's not necessarily an easy thing to do, but keep track of that and to keep track of the rate and the reasons that children leave the club, and to make that information accessible to any parent who wants to know about the retention and injury rate of this club.
I appreciate you pointing out all of these topics. Definitely money takes precedence in our society anymore. And I really appreciate the two of you focusing on the importance of clubs and colleges too, following the best practices, not just throwing the names out there, but how are these individuals treated? How are they supported? Super important to pay attention to all of these. And I appreciate both of you advocating for these kids.
Absolutely. Looking at the community-based programs, I know that you've referenced that quite a bit, and probably our generation grew up doing more community-based programs for longer periods of time. What role would you say the community-based programs play in providing a more inclusive and less financially burdensome alternative for these athletes? And would you encourage athletes to stay in the community-based programs longer?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, they're doing as much as they can, but they tend to be hollowed out. The funding has decreased. They may have trouble finding fields because the fields are increasingly rented out by the pay-to-play clubs. In terms of the kids staying in the community programs, this is a real dilemma. And it usually happens around age 10. The kids have been playing rec in most cases up until about 10, at least in soccer. It might be slightly different for other sports. But then there's this migration of the better athletes to pay to play. And this is when the parents face, it's almost an impossible situation. You've got a super athletic kid. They know about the pay to play. They know there's a higher level of competition out there, and they'd like to be a part of it. And if they stay in rec, they're almost going to stand out in a not a good way anymore. It's like, why is this kid who's like better than everyone else still playing rec? And yet, if they go to pay to play route, it's not only expensive for the parents, but suddenly it's 40 weekends taken up by the sport and several practices a week. And so it's the sort of question that, of course, I'd like to see more and more kids served by the community programs. But because there is this pay-to-play system, it now overshadows the whole focus on the community-based activities. And it provides an illusion that lots of kids are playing sports. I mean, if you go around Portland from about 5 o'clock on, you'll see a lot of kids playing soccer. But what's going on is it's almost always the pay-to-play clubs having practices and the field has been rented. and there's much less of the community activities going on. A lot of journalists have pointed out, for example, you know how more and more municipalities are building these mega sports complexes so they can host the big tournaments? Well, it didn't take long for the clever journalists to realize that the groundskeepers of these professional level facilities that host the big tournaments, their children can't possibly pay to play. The parents can't possibly afford to have their kids play for the pay to play clubs, even as they tend these incredible fields that serve as the location for the big tournaments and all.
I want to second and reinforce that we would definitely advocate for more funding for the community and recreational levels, for fields, for community centers, for programs. I'm hard pressed to believe that those sports programs would not fill up. I believe they would, but they have just been terribly neglected under the illusion that sports are all fine and good now.
I'm feeling this overwhelming sense, probably like you referenced, Ken, that when you took a look at the past however many years of all your children and kind of like what just happened. So I'm feeling a little bit of that. And what I mean by that is a little bit of sadness, maybe, and the fact that I have witnessed a lot of community-based programs going away. And not only going away, but also, like you're saying, it felt like a natural transition to switch to a club as the child developed, as their talents increased, and their desire to play more of the sport. So I almost feel like I've done something wrong as a parent, as I'm listening to you guys, and I hope that I haven't. So I'm conflicted. I kind of don't know how to feel, and I don't know if that's normal or if that's what you guys feel, or Tara, if you feel that way, or if some of our listeners are going to feel that way. I wish that there was a way that the athletes could thrive and continue to grow and develop and get better and be coached by outstanding coaches and programs that put the athletes first. In many cases, that's been my experience for my children. And maybe I am a complete outlier. I'm just feeling so conflicted right now because I've seen beautiful sides of youth sports. And to hear what also exists is sad for me.
I feel you too, Destiny. In our situation where our children are in gymnastics, the schools have gymnastics clubs or teams, but they're not nearly to the level as the pay to play. But it just doesn't exist that they can learn these skills in a safe environment with excellent coaching in that field. I mean, it was disappointing. You know, my children would have loved to have competed for their school. They weren't even allowed. The rules in our state don't allow you to do any club competitions outside of just a very small number a year if you're going to be on the high school team. So there is definitely a regulation there that could be addressed and adjusted.
It was not necessarily our intention to cause discomfort. We do want people to realize that this is quite different than it was a generation ago and presents people with all sorts of difficult questions. But we had all of our children, we asked them to read through the book, first and foremost, because the book includes various stories that we kind of subscribed to them. And we wanted to make sure that they signed off on those anecdotes and all is accurate. But the middle child just confided in Jean that after reading it, she sort of felt a little uneasy at having made us make all the sacrifices that we had to make to allow her to pay to play, which was not our intention in asking her to read it. But she hadn't realized the extent of the money that was required and the extent of the sacrifices. The other anecdote I want to tell quickly, and here I am going to surprisingly rely on my Japan expertise. Every system has its problems. So in Japan, and in fact, throughout East Asia, the way that you get into college is through an entrance exam that's administered by the individual universities. No exaggeration, families throughout East Asia start sending their kids as early as elementary school age to after-school cram schools to start preparing them to stuff their mind with the knowledge necessary to score high on the entrance exam. And by the time they're in high school, they can be going to cram schools for 6 hours a day. Ever since I first went to Japan, every single parent has bemoaned the exam system hell, is what they call it. every single parent I've ever met in Japan takes part in it because the stakes in the East Asian societies where you went to college matters much more than it does here. I mean, we tend to be after a few years after people get out of college, it's really more, do you do your job? Who cares anymore where you went to college? It lasts longer in the East Asian countries, like where you went to school often dictates the next step. And because until recently there was lifetime employment, if you got the right job out of college, then everything was set. And so every system has problems.
I think the anecdote that I want to add to help maybe reflect back a little of what you're saying as parents, it really isn't until we got to the very end of our oldest's journey in sports that a lot of this started to add up for us. And we started to realize that at different data points along the way as parents, you still don't have the full picture. And we also realized that I suppose we might be considered older parents now, but the younger parents who did not have the sports backgrounds that we did in the early 80s, the younger parents may come to see this system as normal in the way that it's always been. And so, for example, I went to one of our daughter's high school lacrosse games. Maybe she was a junior in high school at that point. And in that game, there were no less than 3 ACL tears in one game. Now, I don't know about you all, but that was stunning. It was remarkable. It never happened when we were in high school. I can't tell you one occasion of that. And yet the parents on the sidelines, we all felt bad, but most of them just sort of shrugged and said, well, this is part of the game. But contact injuries, yes, they used to be a part of the game. Overuse injuries, most parents aren't even thinking about at that data point in their journey. And overuse injuries, when you start to talk to the medical experts, have become an enormous part of this game and should be avoidable, given not only the physical, sometimes career-ending damage, but all of the mental health piece that comes along with being away from your peers, the fun, the games, because you've had surgery and you got to do a lot of rehab, and that becomes your social activity for a long time. So it's not normal. It doesn't have to be this way. And it wasn't this way before when there were plenty of enjoyment of athletics at the high school, college, and pro level. Only a short time ago.
That's a perfect segue to our next question, Tara.
Given all this great information that you've shared with us and with your research and your backgrounds, looking ahead, what changes would you both like to see in the youth sports industry to prioritize the well-being of youth athletes and making it more enjoyable for both them and their families?
Unfortunately, some of the national sports organizations are not doing as much as one would like. So if the various sports federations could get to the point where they had the cachet to then say any club that doesn't do things according to these best practices does not have our stamp of approval. And parents hopefully would eventually get to the point that they would immediately look. We're looking for a soccer club for our kids. Does it have the U.S. Soccer Federation stamp of approval? If it doesn't, we're not having anything to do with it. And same with the other sports. That would be one improvement.
I think another improvement that can come to mind for me comes from the example of, I have a sister who has been the head of a swim club, very successful swim club for decades now. And when the Olympics comes around, it's always a very interesting time for the new swimmers coming in and the conversation she chooses to have with these parents. And I think one of the best things I've heard from her through many conversations over the years about the youth sports industry is that she starts off by being incredibly frank and upfront with the parents and saying, we have never once sent any of our swimmers to the Olympic time trials. I've been doing this for a long time with hundreds of athletes. Here might be the percentage of our swimmers that go on to swim in college. Here's our injury rate. She's incredibly upfront with them to help guide their expectations from the beginning about letting this be what it is and what is healthy for children and families, and not just this means to an end of the golden chalice that many people never catch. So just being upfront and clear with parents can be one of the biggest differences between a good club and a not so good club. And like Ken said, following the best practices would go miles in terms of helping our youth athletes.
I think this is probably the least likely, although you just don't know, but ending preferential admissions would basically end the youth sports industry, which is, I'm not saying end college sports. Ending preferential admissions is very different from saying end college sports. A couple of years ago, I would have considered it extraordinarily unlikely, but recently universities have been forced to answer more and more questions about their admissions policies. And it could be going forward that they're going to be pushed to answer more questions. I'm a university professor, and I'm not trying to destroy universities. We need them, but there are some little secrets. And it's interesting that there haven't been more lawsuits by women against the elite universities, because probably the single greatest form of discrimination right now, the women candidates tend to be vastly more academically qualified than their boy counterparts. And yet, in the name of having as close to equal balance between the sexes, they still take 50% guys, or more or less, at college. And so there's all these sort of things that the universities are doing with admissions that, if they come under more and more scrutiny, who knows? At some point, we as a society or Congress may be like, why are you giving preferential admission to athletes? Why are you giving preferential admission to flautists? And why are you giving preferential admission to guy students over female students who did better in high school? I don't know. We'll see. It's hard to predict these things.
And I think we've probably said several times, but if it was no longer year-long, that would make a huge difference in protecting our athletes as well. Year-long basically requires a single sport specialization. Season by season allows for great cross-training again.
Well, we really appreciate you sharing all of your insights and expertise with us. You've opened our minds to different viewpoints and making sure that we're all focusing on the well-being of our children is obviously our number one priority. So thank you so much for coming on with us today. Thank you for writing this book that we can all read and learn more about.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you for your interest. It's really a pleasure talking to you today.
Thank you. We've enjoyed ourselves too. Thank you so much.
So available on Amazon, or go to your local bookstore, ask for it. What is the Goal? The Truth About the Youth Sports Industry by Jean Linscott and Kenneth Ruoff. We're so glad you've joined us today. Thank you for listening. Upcoming episodes and show info can all be found at sportsmomrapport.com. If you've enjoyed the show, please share it with a friend. We'd love to hear from you. So please reach out to us with any comments, or if you or someone you know would like to share their story and connect with us.